everyone, so in today's video I'm going to be talking about everything that you need to buy before you get a leopard gecko. So as you can see, I've got my little leopard gecko here. This is Eloise, and she's going to be starring in this video. So the first thing that I'm going to touch on is I'm going to touch on the enclosure and everything you need to put it together. And then I'm going to touch on food and everything you need to feed your gecko. And then I'm going to be talking about just additional things that you should get in order to give them the best life possible. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about, of course, is the enclosure. Now, when it comes to the enclosure, there's always the aspect with animals of bigger is always better. Now, the minimum size for a leopard gecko is technically 10 gallons, but personally, I think that is way too small. I'm right now using a 20. She is 32 grams right now, so she's kind of like a juvenile. I personally believe with how active she is, a size like a 10 gallon would be way too small for her. So I personally would not use a 10 gallon enclosure. Technically the minimum is 10, but definitely think about, if you can, getting a 20 gallon enclosure for your gecko. Now the next thing you're going to need is you're going to need a heat mat. A heat mat is something that goes under your enclosure and it will provide belly heat for your reptile. These guys need belly heat for digestion. Now the general rule is you want it to be about 1/3 of the size of your enclosure. The reason you don't want it to take up the whole thing is you want to make sure that there's an even temperature gradient. So for example, for Eloise's enclosure, there's a heat mat on this side there is nothing, and then in the middle it's kind of like a mix between the two. So it has a nice gradient, so she can use that to regulate her internal body temperature. Now the next thing is you're going to want to make sure that your heat mat is attached to a thermostat. A thermostat is something that can control the temperature of the heat mat and will set it at a certain temperature. So you want to have it set at around 90. They are very sensitive and they could easily get burnt if it's too hot, but if it's too cold, they won't be able to digest their food properly, so it's really important that your temperatures are just right. The next thing that you're going to need for your enclosure is substrate. Now substrate is something that there's lots of options that you can use. But the number one thing is you don't want to use loose substrate. You want to have a substrate that they cannot accidentally digest. So this can be non-adhesive shelf liner, which is what I am using. You can use tile, you can use paper towel, newspaper, anything like that. Just a matter of how you want it to look and how easy you want it to clean. Now the next thing you're going to want is some thermometers. Now, yes, I did use it plural. You're going to want one for the cool side and one for the warm side. If you're on a thermostat, which you should be, you generally don't need one for your warm side because the thermostat will kind of act as the thermometer. I also highly suggest getting an infrared thermometer. Digital ones are the second best and an infrared is the absolute best. And so you should always have that as a backup, but have one on your enclosure as well. Another thing that is something you might want to get is something called a hygrometer. This measures the humidity in your tank. You want to make sure that the humidity is low. The next thing that you're going to want for your enclosure is a background. As you can see, I have a background on mine. You want to make sure that you kind of make your leopard gecko feel safe. Have something that blocks the light from behind. Other things you're going to want for your enclosure are, if you choose to use a Uvb light, you're going to want a light dome, which is the one I just have over there, and then your Uvb light. This is something that's very controversial. Some people think you should use it. Some people are strongly against it. It's very much up to you on whether or not you want to use it or not. Basically, you just don't want any bright lights for your gecko, and you certainly don't want to use red or blue lights because they will harm their eyes. If you want to add some heat from above because your cool side is a little bit too cool, then what you're going to want is you're going to want to get something called either a ceramic heat emitter or a deep heat projector. And these two things are something that will heat the air from above, but it will not provide any light. So that is one thing that you can use instead of using a red lamp that will provide heat. Now moving on from the kind of like, I guess, the technical part of a leopard gecko enclosure, we're going to move on to the more fun part. Number one thing is you're going to need your food dishes. The first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need a little calcium dish. This can be very small. Leopard geckos will consume their calcium as they need it. They're very self-sufficient that way. So basically you just want to have a little dish that they can go and get calcium at any time. I will get into the type of calcium that you need later on in the video when we reach the food section. The next thing that you're going to need is a water dish. This can be small or large. You just want to make sure that they always have an access to water, and you want to make sure it's on the cool side of your enclosure just so it's not evaporating as quickly. Now, whether or not you have a food dish in your enclosure is very dependent on your gecko. My gecko personally likes to only eat either on her own, and sometimes she'll be tong fed, but she doesn't like to eat out of a bowl. So I don't need a food bowl for her because she won't eat out of it anyway, but there definitely is that option there. One last thing that you're going to want is you're going to want a dish for your multivitamin. Just like the vitamin D3, you want to have something that your gecko can access at all times, and that will be your multivitamin. Now when it comes to the decor of the enclosure, that is probably the most fun part and is also the most unique part. Now you can have a very open enclosure, or you could have something that's a little bit more full like mine is. There are 3 things to a leopard gecko enclosure that you're going to need no matter what, no matter your gecko, is 3 hides. You're going to need one on the warm side, one on the cold side, and one in the middle. That is an enclosed hide that will double as your humid hide. They'll use this to shed, and because it's enclosed, it'll hold humidity a lot better. So now that we touched on everything in the enclosure, I'm now going to address the food, everything you're going to need to feed your gecko. Now, there are kind of 2 components to this: what you're going to feed your gecko and what you're going to feed your feeders. There is something that is called gut loading, which is basically when you feed your insects something so that those nutrients are in the worm or cricket or whatever feeder insect you're using, and then they are passed along to your gecko through that. Some common feeder insects are going to be superworms, mealworms, dubia roaches, crickets, phoenix or calci worms, and silkworms. These are a lot of different options for you to choose for your gecko. And then there's also some treat foods such as waxworms, hornworms, or butterworms. No matter what insect you choose to feed your gecko, you're going to need something to contain them. Now, what kind of container will work for you really depends on the insect that you're using. For example, something like a cricket will break out of everything, and you really need a special cricket keeper, and be prepared to find some in your home because they will break out. But if you're just feeding your gecko worms, then you're only really going to need a small plastic Tupperware container or maybe a tote. And then I personally put a little cheesecloth over it, but you could also use just a lid that you have holes punctured in, anything that allows some ventilation to occur. Another thing that you're going to need to keep your worms is you're going to need a bedding. Now, some people use wheat bran, some people use oats, so I would say 2 inches is like the magic number of bedding you want to have in there, and the worms will eat off of that and they'll be good for your gecko to eat. Now, your insects are going to eat either leafy greens, some carrots, apples, potatoes, anything like that. I personally use carrots a lot of the time. You're going to need just some little food scraps. If you don't eat these foods yourself, you will have to go and get some for your animals, but hopefully you eat your vegetables, and so you have some of these, at least one of them, lying around. Now, for people who are against touching worms or crickets or bugs in general, whatever you're using, I would suggest getting some wooden tongs. You want to make sure that they're wooden because metal ones can actually be quite sharp, and when they bite, they could hurt their teeth or their inside of their mouths. Now, earlier in this video, when I was talking about some dishes that you need, I mentioned getting a multivitamin and some calcium. Now, there are lots of different types of multivitamins out there. I personally use Reptivite, and you can get this either reptile stores, Amazon, anything like that. They're very easy to come by. And then when it comes to calcium, you want to make sure that you have either one without D3 if you're using a Uvb light, or one with D3 if you are not. Some people will also suggest using a calcium without D3 in your enclosure, but dusting your insects with the calcium and D3. So there's a lot of different approaches you can take. The most common one, though, is leaving with D3 and the reptile vitamin in your enclosure. Now, one last thing that I would say to make sure you get before you get a leopard gecko is an exotic vet. Now, I've never had to take any of my geckos to the vet, but they live a very long time, and there's a very high chance that I will have to take one of my geckos to the vet at one point in their lifetime. You don't want to have your gecko and then lose it to something because maybe you weren't prepared and didn't know that you had no exotic vet in your area. I've heard a lot of times where people have instances where their gecko is sick and either they don't know where their exotic vet is, maybe they don't have any funds aside for the exotic vet, and they actually end up losing their gecko over something that was quite preventable. You need to think about this before you get your gecko. not after, not when it's sick. You need to think about it before that. Another random item that you're going to need is you're going to need a carrying case. This could be something if you ever need to take your gecko somewhere, or if you want to clean your cage and maybe it's not tame yet, maybe it just hates being handled, maybe you just don't want to have to, constantly keep an eye on it. You want to have it somewhere contained that it can't get hurt, can't get into anything, or especially if you have other pets. So having a carrying case is definitely a good idea. And now there's one last thing that you're going to need when you get a leopard gecko, and that's your gecko. That is all for today, and I hope you kind of learned a little bit about what you need to get a leopard gecko. But I hope you found this video educational and maybe entertaining a little bit. If you want to see more videos like this, then make sure you subscribe. I hope to have a lot more videos of leopard geckos in the future, and I did film this setup as well if you're interested in seeing me put it all together. But that is all for today, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye guys!